They say grief changes you, but nobody warns you that sometimes the people you trust most will try to use that grief to destroy you. They'll wait until you're at your weakest, when the weight of loss makes every breath feel like drowning. And then they'll strike. They'll tell you that your pain has made you unstable, that your tears are proof you can't be trusted, that your love was never real to begin with. My name is Rebecca Martinez, but everyone calls me Becca. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 8 months ago, I lost my husband, Staff Sergeant David Martinez, to an IED explosion in Kandahar province. He was 32 years old, a Marine for 12 years, and the kind of man who would give his last dollar to a stranger if they needed it more than he did. We'd been married for 7 years, and in all that time I never once doubted that we'd grow old together. David left behind more than just memories. He left behind a construction company he'd built from nothing, a house we'd saved for 3 years to buy, and a life insurance policy that was supposed to take care of me when he couldn't. What he also left behind was a family that smiled at his funeral but sharpened their knives the moment the dirt hit his coffin. 6 months ago, I sat in a sterile conference room at Walsh Associates, listening to David's will being read. I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the way the leather chairs creaked when people shifted uncomfortably, the smell of coffee gone cold. David's brother Robert sat across from me, his wife Nicole beside him, both of them wearing expressions I'd never seen before. Hard. Calculating. David's parents, Patricia and Frank, sat at the head of the table, their faces unreadable. The lawyer, Susan Walsh, cleared her throat and began reading. According to the will, everything went to me: the house on Maple Street, the construction company, the life insurance. Everything. It was exactly what David and I had discussed, exactly what we'd planned. But the moment those words left her lips, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Robert was the first to speak. "This can't be right," he said, his voice tight with something I couldn't identify yet. "David would never leave the family business to someone who doesn't even understand construction." Nicole leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "Becca, honey, you know David was under a lot of stress before he deployed. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What are you trying to say?" Patricia, David's mother, spoke up. Her voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath. "We're just concerned about you, dear. This is a lot of responsibility for someone who's never worked a day in construction. David built that company with his own hands. It's his legacy." Frank nodded slowly. "Maybe we should discuss this as a family. Find a solution that works for everyone." I looked around the table, seeing faces I'd shared Christmas mornings with, people who'd welcomed me into their family when David and I got married. But something had shifted. The warmth I'd always felt from them was gone, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. It started small, almost gentle. Robert would stop by the house, ostensibly to check on me, but he'd always find a reason to mention how overwhelming the business must be. David had 20 years of experience, he'd say, sitting in David's favorite chair like he belonged there. "The guys who work for us, they're not going to respect someone who's never swung a hammer," Nicole would call, her voice syrupy with false concern. "I was talking to some of the other wives at the base," she'd say. "They're worried about you. They think you're isolating yourself. Maybe you should consider grief counseling." The implication was always the same. I was fragile, I was overwhelmed, I was incapable of handling what David had left me. And maybe, just maybe, they were right to be concerned. But I wasn't fragile. I was a registered nurse who'd worked 12-hour shifts in the trauma unit at Phoenix General for 8 years. I'd held dying patients' hands while their families fell apart. I'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. I'd managed our household finances while David was deployed, paid our bills, maintained our home, and kept our marriage strong across 7,000 miles and 3 combat tours. The problem wasn't that I was weak. The problem was that I was alone. David's death had severed more than just our marriage. It had cut me off from the entire support system I'd built around his family. The Sunday dinners at Patricia and Frank's house stopped. The casual phone calls from Nicole dried up. Even the Christmas card list seemed to have lost my address. I was no longer Becca, David's wife. I was Becca, the outsider who'd inherited what should have belonged to blood. The isolation was intentional, I realized later. Systematic. They were creating a narrative where I was the problem, where my grief had somehow made me selfish, where my lack of construction experience proved I didn't deserve what David had worked so hard to build. They whispered in church circles about how I was struggling to cope. They mentioned to mutual friends that they were concerned about my decision-making. They planted seeds of doubt about my mental state, my motivations, my right to carry on David's legacy. And for a while, it worked. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I didn't understand the construction business well enough. Maybe David's family knew what was best for his company, his legacy, his memory. Maybe love wasn't enough to make me worthy of what he'd left behind. The doubt ate at me like acid. I'd lie awake at night in our bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if David would be disappointed in me. If he'd want me to fight for what was ours, or step aside for what was easier. I'd hold his dog tags, the ones he'd worn through 3 deployments, and try to hear his voice through the silence. But the silence was deafening. And in that silence, his family grew bolder. 3 months after the will reading, Robert showed up at my door with a folder thick enough to choke a horse. His smile was the kind you see on used car salesmen, right before they tell you about the hidden fees. Nicole stood behind him, clutching her designer purse like it contained the crown jewels, her expression a careful mask of sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Becca, we need to talk," Robert said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. He'd been doing that a lot lately, treating David's house like it was already his. He settled into David's recliner, the one with the worn armrest where my husband used to rest his coffee mug during Sunday football games, and spread the papers across the coffee table with theatrical precision. "We've been talking to some lawyers," Nicole said, perching on the edge of the couch like she was afraid to get too comfortable, "about the situation with David's will, the situation." As if my husband's final wishes were some kind of clerical error that needed correcting. Robert leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. "Look, we know you love David. Nobody's questioning that. But love doesn't qualify you to run a construction company or manage the kind of assets we're talking about here." I felt my spine straighten, the same way it did when difficult family members questioned my medical decisions in the ICU. David left everything to me because he trusted me to handle it. "David was emotional when he made that will," Nicole interjected softly. "He was about to deploy. He wasn't thinking about the practical aspects of running a business, about what would actually be best for his legacy." Robert nodded, pulling out a document from the top of the pile. "We've had some experts look at the company's financials. It's more complicated than you realize, Becca. There are contractor licenses, union negotiations, equipment leases, insurance policies. It's not something you can just learn on the job." The way he said it made it sound like I was a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. I'd been managing complex medical equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars since I was 25 years old. I'd coordinated care for patients whose lives hung in the balance based on split-second decisions. But apparently, none of that mattered when it came to understanding invoices and project timelines. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Patricia and Frank walked in then, as if their arrival had been carefully choreographed. Patricia carried a casserole dish, because apparently bringing food was supposed to soften the blow of whatever they were about to do. Frank looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Robert and the floor, but he didn't speak up. "We're suggesting a partnership," Robert said, his voice gaining confidence now that his parents were here to back him up. "You keep your share of the life insurance, obviously, and you can stay in the house for now. But the business should be managed by someone who understands it. Someone who knew David's vision," Nicole added, as if she'd rehearsed the line. "Someone who's worked construction their whole life," Patricia said, setting the casserole down on the kitchen counter and joining us in the living room. The someone they were talking about was Robert, of course. Robert, who'd spent most of his 20s getting drunk and picking fights in dive bars while David was building his company from the ground up. Robert, who'd only started working construction because David had given him a job when no one else would hire him. Robert, who'd been jealous of his younger brother's success for as long as I'd known the family. David specifically chose not to leave the business to you, I said, looking directly at Robert. If he'd wanted you to have it, he would have put that in his will. The mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something ugly flash across Robert's face before he composed himself. David was protecting you, he said. He knew you'd be grieving, that you wouldn't be in any condition to make major business decisions. He left everything to you because he loved you, not because he thought you could actually handle it. That's ridiculous, is it? Nicole pulled out her phone, scrolling through something. When's the last time you balanced the company's books, Becca? When's the last time you reviewed a contract or met with a client? Heat flooded my cheeks. The truth was, I hadn't done any of those things. I'd been too busy planning a funeral, settling insurance claims, and trying to figure out how to keep breathing without the man who'd been my anchor for 7 years. The business had been running on autopilot under the management of David's foreman, Miguel Santos, who'd been with the company since David started it. Miguel's been handling the day-to-day operations, I said. Miguel's a good foreman, Robert acknowledged, but he's not an owner. He's not making the big decisions. And some of those decisions can't wait much longer. Frank finally spoke up, his voice gruff with discomfort. There's a commercial project coming up, city contract for the new community center. It's worth more than the company has ever handled before. If we get it, it could set us up for years. If we mess it up, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. This was my test, my chance to prove I belonged in David's world, or my opportunity to fail spectacularly and prove their point for them. The bid is due next week, Robert said, pulling out another document. It requires extensive financial projections, proof of bonding capacity, detailed project management timelines. Are you prepared to handle that? I stared at the papers, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. The numbers and terminology might as well have been written in ancient Greek. David had tried to explain the business side of things to me over the years, but I'd always been more interested in hearing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. About the actual construction work, the satisfaction he got from building something lasting and meaningful. I can learn, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. In a week? Nicole's eyebrows rose in what might have been genuine concern or calculated skepticism. Becca, this isn't a game. If you submit a bad bid, it doesn't just affect you. It affects every worker who depends on this company for their livelihood. It affects David's reputation. There it was, the killing blow. David's reputation. The suggestion that my incompetence could somehow tarnish the memory of a man who'd died serving his country, who'd built his business on integrity and hard work. Robert leaned back in the recliner, studying my face. We're not asking you to give up everything, he said, his tone gentling in a way that made my skin crawl. We're asking you to be practical. Let me handle the business side. You keep the house, the life insurance, everything personal. We'll work out a partnership agreement that's fair to everyone. What kind of partnership? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. 60-40 split, he said. I take on the daily operations, the client relationships, the financial management. You maintain ownership, but I handle the work. 60% for him, 40% for me. For the business my husband had built with his own hands, the legacy he'd specifically left to me. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, Patricia said, reaching over to pat my hand. This is a big decision. But don't take too long, dear. Time is a luxury we don't have with this contract deadline approaching. They left me alone with their papers scattered across my coffee table like evidence of a crime I didn't yet understand I was being accused of. The casserole sat cooling on my kitchen counter, a peace offering for the war they'd just declared. I picked up the commercial contract requirements, trying to make sense of the language. Bonding capacity. Prevailing wage requirements. Performance guarantees. It might as well have been written in Sanskrit. But as I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of my husband's life, I remembered something David had told me during one of his deployments. The thing about being a Marine, he'd said over a crackling phone connection from Afghanistan, is that you never give up ground without a fight. Even if the odds are against you, even if you're outgunned and outnumbered, you hold your position until you can't hold it anymore. I looked around the living room, at the pictures of our wedding, at the folded flag they'd given me at his funeral, at the Purple Heart displayed on the mantelpiece. This wasn't just a house or a business. This was the ground David had chosen to defend when he wrote his will. This was the territory he'd entrusted to me. And I wasn't ready to surrender it without a fight. The first thing I did was call Miguel Santos. He'd been David's right-hand man for 8 years, starting as a laborer fresh out of high school, and working his way up to foreman through sheer determination and skill. David had always spoken of him with genuine respect, the kind you earn by showing up every day and getting the job done right. Miguel answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent the day wrestling with concrete and steel. "Mrs. Martinez? Everything okay?" "I need to ask you something, Miguel, and I need you to be completely honest with me." There was a pause, and I could hear the sounds of construction in the background, the rhythmic hammering and distant rumble of machinery. "What's on your mind?" "Robert came by today. He says I'm not qualified to run the company, that I need to step aside and let him take over operations. He says the business is too complicated for someone like me." The silence stretched longer this time. When Miguel finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What do you think, Mrs. Martinez?" It wasn't the answer I'd expected, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. He wasn't going to make this decision for me. He was asking me to make it for myself. "I think David left me this company for a reason," I said. "I think he trusted me to figure it out." "Then you've got your answer." "But Miguel, I don't know the first thing about bidding commercial projects. This community center contract, it's due next week, and I don't even understand half the terminology." "David didn't know those things either when he started," Miguel said. "You think he came out of the Marines knowing how to read architectural blueprints and calculate material costs? He learned because he had to, because he wanted to build something that mattered." I felt something loosen in my chest, the first breath of real air I'd taken since Robert had walked into my living room with his folder full of intimidation. "Would you help me?" I asked. "With the bid, I mean. Would you walk me through it?" "Mrs. Martinez," Miguel said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I've been waiting 8 months for you to ask me that question." The next morning, I met Miguel at the company office, a modest building in an industrial park on the outskirts of Phoenix. I'd been there before, of course, but always as David's wife, never as the owner. The receptionist, Maria, looked up when I walked in, her face brightening with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Martinez, it's so good to see you here." Miguel emerged from the back office, carrying a stack of blueprints and wearing the kind of expression I recognized from my nursing days. Focused. Determined. Ready to teach someone something that could save a life, or in this case, save a business. "Let's start with the basics," he said, spreading the community center plans across the conference table. "This project isn't as complicated as Robert made it sound. It's a single-story building, mostly concrete block construction with steel frame additions. We've done bigger jobs." For the next 4 hours, Miguel walked me through every aspect of the bid process. He showed me how to calculate material costs, how to factor in labor hours, how to account for overhead and profit margins. He explained bonding requirements and prevailing wage laws, breaking down complex concepts into language I could understand. "The thing about construction," he said as we reviewed the timeline requirements, "is that it's not magic. It's math and planning and showing up every day ready to work." David understood that. He knew the most important part wasn't knowing everything from the start. It was being willing to learn and having people around you who could fill in the gaps. As the day wore on, I began to see the project differently. Instead of an insurmountable challenge, it started to look like a puzzle with pieces that fit together in logical ways. Miguel had been doing most of this work already, I realized. The estimates, the scheduling, the coordination with subcontractors. David had trusted him with the details while focusing on the bigger picture of growing the business. "Why didn't Robert know about your role in all this?" I asked as we calculated the final numbers. Miguel's expression darkened slightly. "Because Robert never asked. He assumed I was just another worker following orders. He never bothered to learn what I actually do here." By 5 o'clock, we had a complete bid package. Professional, competitive, and technically sound. As I reviewed the final documents, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death. Pride. Not just in what we'd accomplished, but in my ability to learn, to adapt, to step into a role I'd never imagined for myself. "This is good work," Miguel said, gathering up the papers. "David would be proud." I drove home that evening with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since the will reading, I felt like I belonged in David's world. Like maybe his trust in me hadn't been misplaced after all. But when I pulled into my driveway, Robert's truck was already there. He was sitting on my front porch, and the expression on his face told me he'd heard about my day at the office. Nicole sat beside him, her arms crossed, looking like she'd been sucking on lemons. "We need to talk," Robert said as I approached the front door. "I think we've talked enough for one day." "Becca, what you did today was incredibly irresponsible," Nicole said, standing up and blocking my path to the door. "Going behind our backs, getting Miguel involved in this mess. You're going to destroy everything David worked for." "I submitted a bid for a project," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "That's what business owners do." "You don't know what you're doing," Robert said, his voice rising. "You spent one day playing pretend and now you think you understand construction? This isn't a game, Becca. Real money is at stake. Real jobs." "David's jobs," I corrected. "David's company. David's vision. Not yours." Robert stood up then, his size suddenly intimidating in a way I'd never noticed before. He'd always been bigger than David. Broader through the shoulders, thicker around the middle. But David had carried himself with quiet confidence, while Robert radiated barely contained aggression. "You want to know the truth about David's vision?" he said, stepping closer. "David knew you weren't cut out for this. He told me so himself before his last deployment." The words hit like a physical blow. "That's not true. He said you were too soft for the construction business. Too emotional. He said he was leaving you the company because he loved you, not because he thought you could run it. He expected you to be smart enough to step aside when the time came." Nicole nodded sympathetically. "He didn't want to hurt your feelings by putting conditions in the will, but he thought you'd understand when reality hit." I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, the confidence I'd built throughout the day crumbling like a house of cards. Had David really said those things? Had I misunderstood his intentions completely? "I don't believe you," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Robert pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. He sent me a text 2 weeks before he died. "Look." He held the screen toward me and I saw David's number, a message that made my heart stop. "Keep an eye on Becca for me. She's stronger than she knows, but the business world can be brutal. She might need help when I'm gone." The words swam in front of my eyes. Keep an eye on Becca. She might need help. It wasn't the ringing endorsement of my capabilities I'd imagined. It was concern. Worry that I wouldn't be able to handle what he was leaving me. "You see?" Nicole said gently. "He loved you too much to say it directly, but he knew you'd need support. That's all we're offering. Support." I stared at the phone screen, reading the message over and over. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of my newfound confidence. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe I was playing pretend. Maybe one day of learning the basics didn't qualify me to run a construction company. "The bid you submitted today," Robert continued, pocketing his phone. "Miguel helped you with that, didn't he? You didn't do it yourself." "Miguel explained the process, but I made the decisions." "Did you? Or did you just sign off on what he told you to do?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The truth was, Miguel had guided me through every step. I'd learned the concepts, yes, but he'd done most of the actual work. Without him, I would have been completely lost. "That's what I thought," Robert said, interpreting my silence correctly. "Becca, there's no shame in admitting you're in over your head. David left you well provided for. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." "Just let us handle the business side," Nicole added. "You focus on healing, on moving forward with your life." That's what David would have wanted. They left me standing on my own front porch, holding the keys to a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table where David and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our future and dreamed about the life we'd build together. I pulled out my laptop and reread the bid documents Miguel and I had prepared. The numbers were solid, the approach was sound, but Robert's words echoed in my head. Had I really understood any of it? Or had I just been following Miguel's lead? I thought about David's text message, about the concern in his words. Had I been fooling myself about his faith in my abilities? Had his decision to leave me the company been an act of love rather than confidence? The house felt empty around me, filled with echoes of conversations and laughter that would never happen again. David's coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher where I'd left it 8 months ago, unwashed because cleaning it felt like erasing the last trace of our morning together. For the first time since his death, I wondered if maybe everyone else was right. Maybe I was just a grieving widow trying to hold on to something that was never really mine to begin with. Maybe the kindest thing I could do for David's memory was to step aside and let someone more qualified carry on his legacy. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, I remembered something else David had told me. It was during our 2nd year of marriage, when I'd been struggling with a particularly difficult case at the hospital. A young mother had died despite everything we'd done to save her, and I'd been questioning whether I was cut out for trauma nursing. The difference between brave and stupid, David had said, holding me while I cried, isn't whether you're scared, it's whether you keep going anyway. I looked around the kitchen, at the pictures on the refrigerator, at the calendar still turned to the month David had died. This was my ground to defend, not because I was qualified, not because I was ready, but because David had chosen me to defend it. And tomorrow I was going to find out exactly what that choice meant. I woke up the next morning to my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the persistence of the ringing made me answer. Mrs. Martinez, this is Captain Elena Rodriguez, from the Marine Corps Casualty Assistance Office. I apologize for calling so early, but I have some questions about your husband's personal effects. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. The Marine Corps had been thorough about returning David's belongings after his death. Everything had been accounted for, cataloged, and delivered to me with military precision. What kind of questions? We've been conducting a routine audit of personal effects processing, and there appears to be a discrepancy in your husband's file. According to our records, Staff Sergeant Martinez had additional personal items that weren't included in the initial return. My heart started beating faster. What kind of items? I'd prefer to discuss this in person if that's possible. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? I'm driving down from Luke Air Force Base. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't a routine call. Marines didn't drive 2 hours for paperwork errors. Of course. What time? 2 o'clock. I have your address on file. After she hung up, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, trying to process what I'd just heard. David had been meticulous about his personal affairs. Before each deployment, he'd gone through his belongings with the same attention to detail he applied to everything else in his life. What could possibly be missing? I spent the morning cleaning the house with nervous energy, straightening picture frames and dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting. By the time Captain Rodriguez arrived, I'd worked myself into a state of anxious anticipation that reminded me of waiting for test results at the hospital. Captain Rodriguez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of bearing that came from years of military service. She wore dress blues and carried a leather portfolio that looked official and slightly ominous. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," she said as I led her into the living room. "I know this must be difficult, reopening matters related to your husband's death. What exactly is this about, Captain?" She opened her portfolio and pulled out a manila folder. During our audit, we discovered that Staff Sergeant Martinez had filed additional paperwork with the base legal office just 3 days before his final patrol. A sealed envelope marked for delivery to his next of kin in the event of his death. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "I never received any sealed envelope." "That's the discrepancy we're investigating." The envelope was logged into the system but never processed through the casualty notification procedures. We found it in a misfiled batch of documents that should have been included with his other personal effects. She reached into the folder and pulled out a white envelope, official-looking, with David's handwriting across the front. "Rebecca Martinez, to be opened only in the event of my death." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was heavier than I'd expected, with something substantial inside beyond just paper. David's handwriting was clear and careful, the way he wrote important things. "I'll leave you to review the contents in private," Captain Rodriguez said, standing up. "If you have any questions or if there's anything that requires follow-up action, please don't hesitate to contact me. She left her business card on the coffee table and saw herself out, leaving me alone with an envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I turned it over in my hands, studying David's handwriting, the official Marine Corps legal office seal on the back. With shaking fingers, I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a folded legal document, and a small key I didn't recognize. I unfolded the letter first. David's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages of Marine Corps letterhead. "My dearest Becca," it began. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it home from Afghanistan, and I'm so sorry. I know how much pain you must be in right now, and I wish I could be there to hold you through it." I had to stop reading for a moment, tears blurring my vision. This wasn't the will that had been read in the lawyer's office. This was something else, something more personal. "I need you to know that everything I'm leaving because I believe in you completely. Not because you need taking care of, but because you're the strongest person I know. I've watched you save lives in the trauma unit, seen you make decisions under pressure that most people couldn't handle. You have everything it takes to run the company, to build something even better than what I started." The words hit me like a physical force. This wasn't the concerned, protective tone Robert had claimed characterized David's thoughts about my capabilities. This was confidence, absolute and unwavering. "I know Robert will try to convince you that you're not qualified, that you need his help. Don't listen to him, Becca. I love my brother, but he's always been jealous of what I built. He'll use your grief against you, make you doubt yourself when you're most vulnerable. That's why I'm writing this letter and filing these additional documents." My heart was pounding now. Additional documents. I picked up the folded legal paper and opened it carefully. It was a codicil to David's will, dated just 3 days before his death. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was crystal clear. In the event that anyone contested the original will or attempted to claim that David had been mentally incompetent when he'd written it, this document provided additional evidence of his intent and mental clarity. But more than that, it contained specific instructions for Miguel Santos. David had formally designated him as the company's operations manager, with a salary increase and a clear path to partial ownership if the business continued to grow. It was a backup plan, a way to ensure continuity and expertise without giving control to Robert. The 3rd page of the codicil contains something that made my breath catch. A detailed account of conversations David had had with Robert over the years. Instances where Robert had expressed resentment about the company's success and made comments about what he would do differently if he were in charge. "Robert told me last Christmas that I was making a mistake leaving everything to you." One entry read, "He said you'd never be able to handle the pressure, that the business would fail within a year. He actually seemed pleased by the idea." Another entry, dated just months before David's deployment, "Robert approached me about making him a partner in the company. When I declined, he said I was being unfair to the family, that blood should come before marriage. He didn't take the rejection well." I felt sick reading these accounts. While I'd been grieving David's loss, Robert had been positioning himself to take advantage of my vulnerability. The sympathy, the concern, the helpful suggestions about stepping aside for the good of the company, it had all been manipulation. The letter continued, "I'm also giving you a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 1247. Inside you'll find additional documents about the company's finances, contracts we haven't finalized yet, and some other things that might be important if anyone ever questions your right to inherit what I've built." I held up the small key, its weight suddenly feeling significant in my palm. David had been protecting me, even from beyond the grave. He'd known his family well enough to anticipate their reaction to his death, and he'd taken steps to ensure I'd have the ammunition I needed to fight back. The final paragraph of the letter brought fresh tears to my eyes. "I know you're probably doubting yourself right now, wondering if you're strong enough to do this alone. But you're not alone, Becca. You have Miguel, who knows the business inside and out. You have Maria, who keeps the office running. You have the respect of every subcontractor and supplier we've ever worked with. Most importantly, you have my complete faith in your abilities. Build something amazing, my love. Build something that would make us both proud." I set the letter down and reached for my phone, dialing the number Captain Rodriguez had left. "Captain, it's Becca Martinez. I've reviewed the contents of the envelope." "Is everything in order, Mrs. Martinez?" "More than in order. Captain, I need to ask you something. the timing of when you found this envelope. Is that really just a coincidence?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Martinez, sometimes the right documents surface at exactly the right time. Your husband had friends at the base who cared about him, who cared about making sure his final wishes were honored." I understood what she wasn't saying directly. Someone had been watching, waiting for the right moment to ensure David's backup plan reached me when I needed it most. After I hung up, I sat in the living room holding David's letter, feeling his presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. This wasn't just about inheriting a business anymore. This was about honoring the faith he'd placed in me, about proving that his judgment had been sound. I looked at the clock. 4:30 in the afternoon. The bank would be open for another hour. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, David's letter in one hand and the safety deposit box key in the other. Whatever was waiting for me in that box, whatever additional protection David had provided, I was ready to find it. Robert had used my grief and isolation against me, convinced me to doubt my own capabilities and David's faith in me. But David had known his brother well enough to see this coming, and he'd prepared for it. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through Phoenix traffic, but it felt like a journey back to myself. With every mile, I felt the confidence that Robert had systematically eroded beginning to rebuild. David hadn't left me the company out of misguided love or protective concern. He'd left it to me because he believed I could handle it. And tomorrow, I was going to prove him right. The bank was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few customers finishing their business before closing time. I approached the customer service desk with David's codicil and the safety deposit box key. "I need to access box 1247, I told the teller. "My husband recently passed away, and I've just received the key through his estate." The process took 20 minutes of paperwork and verification, but finally I was led into the vault area where rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls. Box 1247 was larger than I'd expected, big enough to hold substantial documents. When the bank employee inserted her key along with mine and opened the box, I saw immediately that David had been thorough. The box contained 3 thick manila envelopes, each labeled in his careful handwriting. The first envelope was marked, "Financial Records, Company Growth Plan." The second read, "Contracts and Legal Documents." But it was the third envelope that made my pulse quicken. "Robert, Documentation and Evidence." I signed for access to a private room and spread the contents of all 3 envelopes across the table. What I found there would change everything. David hadn't just protected my inheritance. He'd documented a pattern of behavior that painted Robert in a very different light than the concerned brother-in-law who'd been offering to help me manage the business. And as I read through page after page of evidence David had carefully collected and preserved, I realized that the real fight was just beginning. The documents in the third envelope painted a picture that made my stomach turn. David had been methodically documenting Robert's behavior for over 2 years, starting long before his final deployment. What I'd dismissed as sibling rivalry had actually been a calculated campaign of undermining and manipulation. The first document was a printout of text messages between Robert and Nicole, discussing their plans to, quote, "convince Becca she's in over her head" after David's death. The timestamps showed these conversations had taken place just weeks after David had deployed to Afghanistan, while I was still writing him daily letters and counting down the days until his return. "She'll crumble under the pressure," one message from Nicole read. "David always handled everything. She's never had to make real decisions about the business." Robert's response chilled me. "The key is making her think it's her idea to step aside. If we push too hard, she might dig in her heels. Better to let her fail first, then swoop in as the solution." I sat back in the bank's private room, my hands shaking as I processed what I was reading. While David had been risking his life for his country, his own brother had been plotting to steal his legacy. While I had been praying for my husband's safe return, Robert and Nicole had been planning for his death. The next set of documents revealed the depth of Robert's deception. David had discovered that Robert had been using the company's name and reputation to secure personal loans, forging David's signature on documents that made Martinez Construction liable for Robert's gambling debts. The amounts were staggering: Nearly $40,000 that Robert had borrowed from various lenders, using the business as collateral without David's knowledge. But it was the final document in the envelope that made everything click into place. A notarized statement from Miguel Santos, dated just 2 days before David's death, detailing a conversation he'd overheard between Robert and a man named Kevin Brennan, who identified himself as an attorney. According to Miguel's statement, Robert had approached Brennan about contesting David's will, claiming that David's deployment stress had made him mentally incompetent when he'd written it. Brennan had advised Robert on the specific language to use, the psychological pressure points to exploit, and the timeline for mounting a challenge that would have the best chance of success. The widow will be vulnerable, Brennan had apparently said. Grief makes people doubt themselves. If you can convince her she's not capable, she might sign over control voluntarily. Much cleaner than a court battle. I thought about every interaction I'd had with Robert since David's death, every carefully worded suggestion that I wasn't qualified, every gentle push toward letting him take control. It hadn't been concern for my well-being or David's legacy. It had been a script, written by a lawyer who specialized in manipulating grieving widows. My phone buzzed with a text message. Robert. Hey Becca, just checking in. Have you had time to think about our conversation yesterday? The community center bid deadline is tomorrow. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, he was still playing his role, still pretending to be the helpful brother-in-law worried about my capabilities. But I had something he didn't know about. I had David's evidence, his real will, and his unwavering faith in my abilities. I gathered all the documents and drove straight to Miguel's house. He lived in a modest neighborhood about 20 minutes from the company office, in a small ranch-style home with a well-maintained yard and a pickup truck in the driveway. When I knocked on his door, he answered in work clothes, clearly surprised to see me. Mrs. Martinez? Is everything okay? Miguel, I need to show you something, and I need to ask you about a statement you gave to David before he died. His expression grew serious, and he invited me inside. His living room was simple but comfortable, with family photos covering the mantelpiece and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. His wife, Carmen, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. This is my wife, Carmen, Miguel said. Carmen, this is David's wife, Becca. Carmen's face immediately softened with sympathy. Oh, Micha, I'm so sorry for your loss. David was a good man. I spread David's documents across Miguel's coffee table, watching his face as he recognized his own notarized statement among the papers. His jaw tightened as he read through the evidence David had collected. I wondered if David would do something like this, Miguel said quietly. He was worried about Robert, about what might happen to you and the company if something happened to him. You knew about Robert's plans? I suspected. David asked me to keep my ears open, to document anything that seemed off. When I overheard that conversation with the lawyer, I knew David needed to know about it. Carmen had been reading over Miguel's shoulder, her expression growing increasingly angry. That man came to your house after the funeral, she said suddenly. Robert, he sat right here in our living room and asked Miguel questions about the business, about whether you had what it takes to run it. Miguel nodded grimly. He was fishing for information, trying to get me to say something negative about your capabilities that he could use later. When I wouldn't give him what he wanted, he offered me a job with better pay if I'd consider working for him instead of you. The manipulation ran even deeper than I'd realized. Robert hadn't just been working on me, he'd been trying to turn David's own employees against me, creating a narrative of incompetence that would justify his takeover. There's something else, Miguel said, getting up and walking to a desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a folder and brought it back to the coffee table. David asked me to keep these safe for you, in case anything happened to him. Inside the folder were copies of all the company's current contracts, financial statements, and client contact information. David had created a complete backup system, ensuring that even if Robert tried to lock me out of the business, I'd have everything I needed to maintain operations. David also told me something else, Miguel continued. He said if Robert ever tried to contest the will or claim the company, I should contact his Marine unit. He said they'd know what to do. My heart skipped a beat. His Marine unit. What did he mean by that? I don't know exactly, but he gave me a phone number. Said it was his squad leader from Afghanistan, a guy named Thompson. Gunnery Sergeant James Thompson. David called him Tank. I stared at Miguel, processing this new information. David had created multiple layers of protection, backup plans for his backup plans. He'd known exactly what kind of fight I'd be facing, and he'd prepared accordingly. Do you still have that number? Miguel nodded and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. David made me promise to call if Robert ever tried anything, said Tank would understand the situation. I took down the number, my mind racing. Tomorrow was the deadline for the community center bid, and I knew Robert was expecting me to fail, to come crawling back to accept his partnership offer, but I had a different plan in mind. Miguel, are you ready to submit that bid tomorrow? His grin was the first genuine smile I'd seen in months. Mrs. Martinez, I've been ready since the day we finished it. That's solid work, and we're gonna win that contract. I drove home with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since David's death. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I was finally seeing clearly, like the fog of grief and manipulation had lifted enough for me to understand what was really happening. That evening, I called Gunnery Sergeant Thompson. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. This is Tank. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, this is Rebecca Martinez, David Martinez's wife. The line went quiet for a moment, then his voice softened. Mrs. Martinez, I've been wondering when you'd call. David told me I might hear from you. He did? Ma'am, David was one of the finest Marines I ever served with. Before his last patrol, he asked me to keep an eye on things back home if anything happened to him. Said his family might give you trouble over his will. I explained everything that had happened since David's death, the pressure from Robert and Nicole, the attempts to convince me I wasn't capable of running the company, the discovery of David's additional documents. Tank listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of acknowledgement. That sounds exactly like the kind of thing David was worried about, he said when I finished. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what do you need from us? I'm not sure. David told Miguel you'd know what to do if Robert tried to contest the will. Tank chuckled, a sound with no humor in it. Oh, we know exactly what to do. David wasn't just worried about legal challenges, Mrs. Martinez. He was worried about his brother trying to destroy his reputation, his legacy, so he asked us to be character witnesses if it ever came to that. Character witnesses? Ma'am, your husband saved my life twice in Afghanistan. He pulled me out of a burning vehicle after an IED attack, then carried me 300 meters to the extraction point while taking enemy fire. He did that kind of thing so often we stopped being surprised by it. David Martinez was a hero in every sense of the word, and if anyone tries to claim he wasn't thinking clearly when he wrote his will, they're gonna have to go through his entire squad to make that argument. I felt tears starting again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than grief. David hadn't just protected me legally and financially, he'd protected me emotionally, ensuring that if Robert tried to tarnish David's memory or claim he'd been unfit to make decisions, there would be people ready to set the record straight. There's something else, Tank continued. David asked us to deliver something to you personally if you didn't make it home. We've been waiting for the right time, but it sounds like that time might be now. What kind of something? A letter from his entire squad, and some other items that belonged to him, things we thought you should have when you were ready to receive them. The next morning, I submitted the community center bid with confidence. Miguel and I had reviewed every detail one final time, and I knew we'd put together a proposal that David would have been proud of. Our numbers were competitive, our timeline was realistic, and our approach was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that had built Martinez Construction's reputation. I was at the company office, reviewing the paperwork one last time before delivery, when Robert burst through the front door. His face was red with anger, and Nicole trailed behind him looking uncomfortable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, waving a piece of paper in the air. "Submitting a bid for a construction project," I said calmly. "What does it look like I'm doing?" "This is insane, Becca. You're going to destroy everything David worked for." "Actually, I'm doing exactly what David wanted me to do. Run his company." Robert's face darkened further. "We tried to do this the easy way, but you're too stubborn to see reason. Nicole and I have been talking to a lawyer. We're going to contest the will." On what grounds? Mental incompetence. David was under extreme stress before his deployment. He wasn't thinking clearly when he wrote that will. No reasonable person would leave a construction company to someone with no experience in the field. I stood up slowly, feeling calmer than I had in months. Robert, I think there are some things you should know before you make any legal moves you might regret. I pulled out copies of the documents David had left in the safety deposit box, spreading them across the conference table. Robert's face went pale as he recognized his own text messages with Nicole, the forged loan documents, the notarized statement from Miguel. David knew exactly what kind of person you are, I said quietly. He documented everything. Your gambling debts, your forged signatures, your plans to manipulate me into giving up control of the company. If you want to contest his will, we can absolutely do that in court. I'm sure a judge would be very interested in reviewing all of this evidence. Nicole had gone completely white, staring at the documents like they were poisonous snakes. Where did you get these? David left them for me, along with a codicil to his will that specifically addresses any attempt to claim he was mentally incompetent. It's dated 3 days before his death and notarized by the base legal office. Want to guess what it says about his mental state? Robert was scanning the documents frantically, his face cycling through a range of emotions. Shock, fear, anger, desperation. This is impossible. David wouldn't have. Wouldn't have what? Protected his wife from his greedy, manipulative brother? You're right, that doesn't sound like David at all. The sarcasm in my voice seemed to snap something in Robert. He lunged forward, grabbing for the papers, but Miguel stepped out of the back office where he'd been waiting and blocked his path. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Miguel said quietly. This is family business, Robert snarled. It doesn't concern you. Actually, it does. David made me operations manager before he died. This is my workplace you're disrupting, and Mrs. Martinez is my boss. The sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot made us all look toward the front windows. 3 military vehicles had arrived, and men in dress uniforms were climbing out. Even through the glass I could see the bearing that marked them as Marines. What the hell is this? Robert demanded. I smiled for the first time in months. That would be David's squad. They have some things they wanted to discuss with you about your brother's mental competence. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson was the first through the door, followed by 4 other Marines I didn't recognize. Tank was exactly what I'd expected from his voice. Tall, solid, with the kind of presence that filled a room and demanded respect. Mrs. Martinez, he said, removing his cover and extending his hand. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but David asked us to make sure his wishes were honored. Robert and Nicole were staring at the Marines like they'd materialized from thin air. Who are you people? Nicole managed to stammer. We're the men who served with Staff Sergeant David Martinez in Afghanistan, Tank said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We're here because someone has been spreading lies about his mental state and his final wishes. One of the other Marines, a man with corporal stripes, stepped forward. Sir, Mrs. Martinez, we have something for you from David. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in David's handwriting. Inside was another letter, this one shorter than the others, but somehow more powerful. Becca, it read. If Tank and the guys are delivering this letter, it means Robert has tried to contest my will. I want you to know that every man standing in that room with you would trust me with their lives, and did trust me with their lives, on a daily basis, for 8 months in Afghanistan. If I was competent enough to lead Marines in combat, I was competent enough to decide who should inherit my business. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Tank spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. Ma'am, we've prepared sworn statements regarding Staff Sergeant Martinez's mental state and decision-making capabilities during his final deployment. We're prepared to testify in any legal proceeding about his competence, his character, and his specific concerns about certain family members attempting to undermine his final wishes. Robert's face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray color. This is harassment. You can't just show up here and intimidate people. We're not intimidating anyone, sir. Tank replied calmly. "We're honoring the final request of a fallen Marine. David Martinez asked us to make sure his wife received what he left her, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Another Marine stepped forward and handed me a small wooden box. "This contains David's personal effects that he specifically requested be given to you if anything happened to him, items that weren't part of the standard return process." I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were David's dog tags, the ones he'd worn for 12 years of service. But there was also something else. A small digital recorder, and a note that simply said, "Play this." I pressed the play button, and David's voice filled the room, clear and strong. "This is Staff Sergeant David Martinez, recording this message on March 15th, 3 days before my final patrol. I am of sound mind and body, and I want to state clearly for the record that any attempt to contest my will or claim that I was mentally incompetent when I wrote it is false and malicious. I have left everything to my wife Rebecca, because I trust her completely to carry on what I've built. If my brother Robert or anyone else tries to claim otherwise, they are lying for their own financial gain." The recording continued for another minute, with David methodically addressing every possible challenge to his will, his mental state, and his reasoning. It was like having him in the room defending me one final time. When the recording ended, the office was completely silent. Robert and Nicole stood frozen, realizing that every angle they'd planned to use had been anticipated and blocked. The Marines stood at attention, a wall of honor and integrity that made Robert's scheming look petty and pathetic by comparison. "I think we're done here," I said quietly. "Robert, if you want to contest David's will, you're welcome to try. But you'll be doing it against not just me, but against every Marine who served with your brother, every piece of evidence he collected about your behavior, and every legal protection he put in place to ensure his wishes were honored." Robert looked around the room one more time, his eyes lingering on the Marines, the documents, and finally, on me. Whatever he saw in my face must have convinced him that the fight was over before it had really begun. "This isn't finished," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It was finished the day David wrote his will. Everything since then has just been you refusing to accept reality." Robert and Nicole left without another word, and I never saw them again. The Marines stayed for another hour, sharing stories about David that made me laugh and cry at the same time. They talked about his leadership, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of the personal cost. "He talked about you constantly," Tank told me as they were preparing to leave. "About how proud he was of your work at the hospital, how much he respected your strength and intelligence. He never had a single doubt about your ability to run that company." 2 weeks later, Martinez Construction was awarded the community center contract. Miguel and I celebrated with the entire crew, and for the first time since David's death, the office felt alive again. 6 months after that, we completed the community center project ahead of schedule and under budget. The city was so impressed with our work that they offered us 2 additional contracts, and I knew David would have been proud of what we'd accomplished. I still miss him every day. I still reach for the phone sometimes to call him with good news, or curl up in his chair when I need to feel close to him. But I no longer doubt that he made the right choice when he left me his company. I've proven to myself, to his employees, and to everyone who doubted me that love and determination are just as valuable as experience when it comes to building something meaningful. The real will wasn't the document that was read in the lawyer's office. The real will was David's absolute faith in my ability to carry on what he'd started, to grow into the role he'd envisioned for me, and to honor his memory by refusing to give up when the fight got hard. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the knowledge that someone believed in you completely, even when you didn't believe in yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.